Welcome to another Synth Hour. And we once again have the illustrious cryss Synthient of Synthient Sound with us. Um,
Illustrious.
it, that was the best one I could come up with while I was thinking about it earlier. Cryss is a music producer. He makes sound packs for synthesizers, sound patches, and he's also a co-host on the ProSynth network. And he's a regular rock star, as far as I can tell. Did I miss? Did I leave anything else out?
And that's too generous already.
So how are things going for you, Cryss?
Yeah, going all right. Wish there were more hours in the day to make music,
I
but
know exactly what you mean.
but
So
how you been?
not too bad. I'm eagerly waiting the last couple parts, which should be here tomorrow, for my secret weapon. I'm calling it. Uh, it's taking a little while, and like you know how it is, flipping this gear to have this gear come in. And the nice thing is it gave me plenty of time to plan out the structure of the rack. Like, okay, what exactly do I want to accomplish, and what are the best parts to do it? And me being a minimalist, I'm like, okay, what is the okay? I'm going to limit myself to this space. What can I fit in there? And what do I absolutely need? And what's optional? And ultimately, I decided, okay, since it's Euro rack, I don't have to limit myself to so like I'll have room for 4 filters in there, but I don't have to just have those because I can have other filters and swap them in for different projects, which I
Uh
don't know why I didn't think of that, a year ago, but I really like that idea because that's kind of how I work anyway. Is okay, these are the synths I'm going to use for this album or this soundtrack, and I limit myself to those so I get to know them really well, and I can just sit
yeah.
down and go, and I don't have to pick through 50 plugins or a stack of equipment or anything. It's just okay, this is what I'm using. I even write it on the little list, even down to the effects. These are the effects, these are the synths. So I can just sit down and go. And so with the Euro rack, I can kind of do the same thing. Like, okay, let's swap in these filters and work with that for 3 to 6 months, however long the project might take. But I'm pretty excited because that's one of the main things I wanted to address with this new setup is I don't like having to be limited to filters and like, well, if I wanted the synthesizer to sound different, I got to get another one because when you buy a synth off the shelf, it's going to come with one, maybe two
Yeah.
filters if you're lucky. And I just like,
Well, I've
go ahead.
yeah, I very much, and I've said it before. I like the kind of way that you do things, and with my very small Euro rack setup, I've kind of had the same philosophy, and I don't do. Although I really enjoy some of the generative, self-generative ambient music on Eurorack, I don't have the time to like just spend doing it. So the when I do dive into those things, I'm kind of the same way. Like I want to know the gear that I have and uh, get into making the music. And I just did uh, a kind of big pedal board project because I hadn't worked on any sort of guitar stuff as far as my gear goes in several years now, which that's a testament to how much I've been into synthesizers lately. But
Yeah.
it is very much the same kind of thing because you have with the Euro rack you have your case which limits you, like this is the space, how am I going to make all this work? And same thing with the pedal board, like the pedal board's only so big, so what are the most important things for me to have on here? And I since I've been working a lot with synthesizers and doing a lot of recording, I'm not used to being limited. I mean, there's times I'll self limit, the way that you do, but I do enjoy like kind of roaming around and finding new things. But with the pedal board setup, it was definitely that kind of thing where I had to figure it out. I had to plan it out. And thank goodness there's these I know there's the Euro rack one. I forget what it's called, but
Modular grid.
where you can go on. Yes, modular grid. Yes, I use that. And there's one for pedal boards called I think it's called Pedal Board Planner. And so you can do the same kind of thing where you're
I'm glad
moving
I never
stuff
found
around
that.
to like, okay. Yeah, that stuff's great. I mean, it really helps into planning because I don't want to be taking measurements and, drawing and that kind of stuff. I mean, I've done it because before there was these websites, there were these websites. That's what you had to do.
Yeah, that's I didn't even think to look for one for pedal boards because I've never used the board. I just use the desk. And then like, well, how many inputs do I
Yeah,
have on whatever mixer interface? And I'll just take up all the inputs and then I'm done buying pedals until I want to swap one for another input or something.
yeah. Hmm.
So our topic that Chris and I decided we would talk about is going to be uh, hardware versus software as it pertains to music production in general. So it's a pretty broad topic. It's going to be really easy for us to fill the hour with it. Um, so first, we're going to talk about the hardware approach to music. We're going to talk about synths, effects. We can talk about pedals. We can talk about compressors. We can talk about keyboards. Just anything and everything that is a solely a hardware based music production workflow, uh, mixing, mastering, and Chris could even talk about performance wise. Um, if he well, so I assume performance wise, when you were performing live, did you ever involve a computer, or was that always hardware based?
Yeah, always hardware based. And so when performing live, 99% of the time it was electric guitar. And there were very few, well, handful of times, depending on what was needed, like I could, I'd play bass guitar because that what I consider another like instrument that I play well. And so, but most of the time it was electric guitar. And then very rarely would I ever do keys or drums. In fact, I tried to avoid drums as much as possible because I'm not really that great. I've taught a number of drummers how to play, but like I don't have the interest to keep it up myself. And my wife has played drums for a while, so usually if there was a drummer needed, she would play, and that kept me out of it. But yeah, with keys also like I'd be helping people like figure out the rig or program it, but as a key player, I didn't really spend much time doing that until the last few years. I mean, I do stuff for recording, but never anything live. So now it's kind of become part of, before COVID hit, it become part of the jam rig where uh, my time playing live had really lessened a lot. So uh, just getting together with friends and making music. And so it began to be part of it where it's like, oh, I'm going to have my guitar rig up set up, but I'm also going to have some synthesizer set up. So like I drag this little one here behind me, the KB37, or, um, grab a polysynth or something just to have there. But yeah, mainly electric guitars.
So um, as far as the live stuff, so obviously with what's going on now, you're not doing a lot of live, but um, I was curious to know as far as the hardware goes, because it sounded like when we last talked, it was a bit of a change to go from doing live stuff, playing guitar almost solely, to
Mhm.
walking into the studio and messing around with synthesizers and recording music and stuff like that. Um, did you? I mean, what was the ratio you would say? Was it mostly hardware based at first, or did you always have a computer, or have you even been able to do production in your studio without a computer at all and without any software?
Um, I think probably my first recording experiences were actually in the mid 90s, and that was with a computer, believe it or not. I had taken a college course on recording, and so uh, I don't remember what was used back then. Like there were Macs with, I think it was Digital Performer or something like that,
Mm.
and then they had some sort of Roland uh, Rompler there that was being used, and then for no, I actually had, I think I'd had a Tascam 424 where there, the four tracks that use the cassette players, like, and I had done recording with that, and it wasn't until probably the early 2000s, or really when, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to remember now. Yeah, a little bit in the late 90s, early 2000s is probably when it picked up with computers and recording. But
Hmm.
I was so busy all the time that I just didn't have time to put into it. So it was more like, the 2010s that I got more into spending time at home recording. And for that, it was more of a mixed setup, especially before I got more serious about synthesizers. It was usually a MIDI controller controlling software synthesizers or samplers or whatever it was. And then the guitar part of it, that would have been the more hardware aspect of it, because I'd be miking up stuff. And then as time has progressed, it's moved more and more in the box with things like Amplitude for virtual guitar amps. And then, I was a pretty early adopter of like Valhalla effects. And so that was, I think Valhalla Ubermod was some of my first plugin I purchased. And so it slowly became shifted to where I was like really enjoying doing stuff in the box. And now obviously I have a lot of hardware, and I'm probably at this moment pretty mixed in my setup. I don't know, we'll be talking about that later, but what about you? Same question. What has been the progression of hardware versus software in your own music experience?
Certainly, software to begin with. Um, I started in GarageBand in 2005 with the built-in
Mm,
stuff. I bought an expansion disc for that at one point, and then I upgraded to Logic, and I was totally in the box for about 10 years, solid 10 years. I did buy a Blofeld and a TR8 in like 2015 just to try them out.
mm-hmm.
And I had some fun with the TR8, but at the time it just felt like more work because I had all the same sounds in the box anyway.
Yeah.
And then the Blofeld, um, I was trying to multi-track it, and that's one of the issues that comes up often about the Blofeld is it doesn't quite have enough processing power to do multi-timbrality, I think is the right word for it, because it'll let you do multiple voices or yeah, multiple patches simultaneously, and I think even maybe track them all simultaneously. I can't remember, but I think I was trying to use it the wrong way. And now if I had another Blofeld on the desk, I would just do one track at a time and you know do it that way
Yeah.
because I know once you start to pile on the effects, especially with I think the comb filtering is particularly CPU heavy,
Mm-hmm.
and that's from 2007, I think. The
Yeah, it's
Blofeld,
been out for a while.
it still sounds good. It surprises me. It's like the MS-2000 in that they did a really good job with the VA algorithms or whatever you want to call it. Whoever designed that thing did a good job. But
There's a guy that does a lot of ambient music with a Blofeld on YouTube. I'm forgetting the name. I bought some of his albums,
mm,
but I was really shocked because a lot of it is just a little key step and a Blofeld and effects, some sort of effects unit, delay, reverb kind of thing.
yeah,
And it's really impressive of what you can accomplish with just such a simple rig.
yeah, yeah. So I ended up selling those, and then 3 or 4 years later, I saw a Prophet 6 demo, and that sounded better than anything that had ever come out of my Logic setup. And I even had Diva at that time. I was like, okay, I'm missing something here because nothing I do can sound like that. There was just, they would call it the 3D sound, the warm sound. It's like coming out of the speakers and like massaging your ears. You would know it well because you did a patch set on the Prophet 6, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So then I was like, okay, what do I want to do? And I slowly started into the journey of getting synthesizers and trying them out. And it's funny because I didn't know anything about synth synthesis or synth architecture or anything because everything in the box I was just using presets, and maybe I would adjust a filter or something or map some element of the existing patch to the mod wheel and automate it or something like that.
Uh-huh.
So for me, getting into synths also was getting learning how to do synthesis, and that was probably the biggest shift. And that's why I would say hardware. That's like there's two sides of that coin. One is the great sound. The other is to make the most of hardware, you have to know synthesis. If you don't, I feel like people are really held back if all they're doing is, hitting the button to switch the patches. And, obviously when you sell patch libraries, that's useful to people, but ideally a person would be able to make any sound that they hear in their head on the hardware that's in front of them. That's the ideal place to be, and that's where I try to get with everything I have. Um, but the more I started using those, and then I started thinking, well, how can I? Is it possible not to have a computer at all? And that led me to my DAWless setup that I had for, gosh, I think 6 or 9 months. Um, which, as far as I know, do you have a hardware sequencer of any kind, or have you had something like that?
Um, yeah, well, I, I don't have anything that's like a dedicated sequencer per se, but I have things that I can manipulate to be sequencers
Mm.
in Eurorack.
Like, have you
So,
used a Deluxe or some sort of electron box or some kind of an MPC at any point?
no, I've never had any groove boxes,
Oh,
and
okay.
while I really appreciate some of the music that I hear people do with them, it's never been a personal interest of mine.
Yeah,
I'd
yeah,
say
because
probably the closest. I mean, and this is not even close, but um, I've got a mutable instruments marbles,
mm,
and so that's probably the closest thing to like any sort of sequencer that I have that's not built into a synthesizer already.
have you used any of the built-in sequencers on your synths?
I have I've checked them out. So I use arpeggiators a lot, but
Okay.
I find using sequencers so tedious. Now, if you're willing to put the time into it, the results of it are fantastic. And some of our most well known synth tracks over of history have. Like thinking about that sequence that comes up at the end of Blade Runner,
Mm.
something like that is it's just so classic. Or some of the TV shows we grew up like Airwolf, where you're thinking about how the sequences, play a part of the music, but it's not really been a part of. I get, and some of this I know just because I've come from guitar. Like I tend to think about things in a little more of a I don't know what you want to call it, but from playing the part in to a track, and so within a DAW, I I spend a lot of time trying to get the part right and as close as I can. And if
Mm.
if I have a good take and there's a mistake, I'll fix it, because if it's a good take, it's a good take, and it shouldn't be lost. And I don't have ages to get it perfect, but I try to get as close as I can. But I think using some sequencers would be it's something I would eventually like to get more into. But right now, again, because of the time element, things like what are they called, like non-Euclidean? sequencers like marbles appeals to me, and that it's so different from any other thing that I do. Like, I understand how a sequencer works, it just takes the time to do it. But with marbles, you're like, okay, let's just have fun and let's see what comes out of this magic box.
Okay, yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I certainly having done a DAW-less setup, I feel like a really good hardware sequencer starts to feel similar to
Uh-huh.
how going using a synthesizer instead of a soft synth. My words aren't working right now. A VST synthesizer versus a hardware
Yeah.
synthesizer is similar to the experience of going from a DAW to a really good hardware sequencer. Like suddenly it's all hands on, and something like the Deluge, which is my favorite, has buttons everywhere. The whole grid is buttons, so there's tactile feedback and visual feedback, and you just turn it on. It works. Um, it's extremely capable, and I'm not pushing a mouse, for the 3 hours that I'm going to be working on something.
Yeah.
So I find that really refreshing, and it's similar to how a real synthesizer is. Yeah, using a hardware sequencer doesn't sound any better, but it's got that tactile experience that But at the same time, if you've got a frustrating hardware sequencer, I found I'd just rather be using Cubase because this thing makes me want to hit my head against the wall. If it's fiddly in some certain way, or if you feel like it's missing something that you really like to do, which I do hope at some point you get to try out a good hardware sequencer, and you'd know better than anyone what would probably suit you well. But it's
Yeah.
definitely a different experience.
I think the ones that really interest me are sequencers that are more visually based, and so like the Polyend, what's it called, the Seek 8, or
Oh, the really
it's
big long one.
yeah,
It's like
it's
that's
like
got a lot of wood on there.
yeah, wood around the
Like I think it's
edges. It's
S.
just yeah, rows of lighted buttons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there's another one that's Oxy something, I don't recall, but it's similar, a little bit smaller. But those kind of things where you have the visual layout of everything, that's probably what appeals to me out of DAWs, is because I can see at once
Mm-hmm.
what's going on, and I'm not. And I think this, my theory is that as a lot of this has comes down to genetics and personality, and that so if we think about how our brains are built and genetics, like there's you know and not to get too much into the biology because I'd be way out of my depths on that, but the accumulation of the biology reveals itself in that, like, people seem to have there tend to be like kind of two axes of which results in four types of learning, and that would be visual, and the opposite of visual would be audio, and then the other two would be tester and kinesthetic. And so testers wanting to be moved by the world, and kinesthetic, of course, is getting your hands in there and moving things in the world. And so I think with those that are more on the visual tester side, being able to see things is more important. And with the kinesthetic
Mm.
and audio learners, they tend to be more about, like, let me touch it and have the tactile sensation of it. Now, of course, everybody has elements of all of those. So, I mean, the very tactile feeling of playing a guitar, I really enjoy. But I know that, like, when I look at a guitar, I don't I don't have the same approach to it. Like, I have a friend who's probably an audio learner, and like if you whistle a melody to him, he'll just like play it out, and he's just got this weird audio memory that is so fascinating to me. But then, like, when I look at a guitar fretboard, I see patterns, and it's a like
Mm.
visual overlay on it, and so it's something that my sight is working with it to manipulate it. So I feel sometimes on like drum machines or sequencers, I feel a little bit lost or blind
Yep.
on them
Yep.
because you're like, well, you have to hit this button twice and then this one, and then you're moving over here, and I'm like, I don't know where I'm at.
Which
I can't.
track am I on?
Yeah, and that kind of freaks me out a little bit. Like I'm lost here. I'm not knowing where I'm at. But I can see how, again, in other types of learners, that's they intuitively perceive that kind of structure much better than I would.
Yeah. 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 Okay. Now we're gonna shift gears. I feel like we barely touched the surface of that one, so we'll have plenty to talk about on another episode. So the software approach, and do you have any experience with a solely software approach? I mean, I know you've got lots of plugins and you really like those. So just talk about software as far as totally in the box. Do you do anything totally in the box?
Yeah, the interesting thing about it is that, well, I guess for someone like me, like you can't totally be in the box. I mean, I guess I could MIDI draw an entire song, but I would never want to do that. So, like at least
Well,
at
we'll
some
include
point,
at least a MIDI controller.
yeah. Okay, so yeah, so that would be
Yeah,
my like minimum, like a MIDI controller.
yeah,
Um, so like you, my earlier experiences with recording using a DAW was more like that. So it's been something that I've been pretty comfortable with, whether it was Digital Performer or Cakewalk back in the 90s, and then GarageBand. And then I moved to Logic
yeah,
and have been on Logic ever since. And so, yeah, there's so much you can do with that, with just an in the box approach that you don't really need hardware at that point. It's more of a flavor, and do you like it, and does it suit your workflow? But I have made a fair amount of music that was just in the box, and I'd say most of my music is actually a mix. It's a hybrid approach that we're going to talk about later. But uh, I have at times, spent more time, like, especially if I'm buying plugins, which, we were talking before, like I used to go through a lot of guitar equipment, a lot of pedals, and was always cycling. And some of it was for the sake of gear money, because I would buy pedals and fix them up and sell them. And so lately, and there was a short time like where I was like, okay, I need to buy some hardware synthesizers because I'm really loving synthesizers. I bought hardware, and then I think it was, what year was it? 2019 was my like foray into Eurorack. And so the latter half of 2019, I sold more gear and I bought some Eurorack stuff. And
so
then
you
since
had beyond
then,
that little guy in the background with
yeah,
Eurorack.
I've got a Mantis, a tip top Mantis that's full of Eurorack modules. I have, the KB. I'm sorry, I probably hit my desk there. The KB37, which has a Model D and some filters and a few other modules in there, distine and whatnot. And then a Matriarch, which is semi-modular. And so those would be the kind of that type of element. But then in 2020, I really didn't buy very much. In fact, I didn't buy any sort of hardware synthesizers at all until December. And I bought a bass, which I hadn't bought a guitar or bass in quite a while. But I spent a lot of the year, other than programming hardware synthesizers and doing sound sets, my recording stuff was probably 75% in the box. And then the other 25% was guitar, electric guitar, bass. And then more and more, I've been working in hardware synthesizers into the recording process.
I would imagine a guitarist like yourself, the idea of being solely in the box wouldn't have a whole lot of appeal. I mean, do you aspire to make music without a guitar involved?
I, yeah, I don't mind it now.
Hmm.
I still make a lot of music with guitar, even when I'm doing like a quote unquote synth track, because it's an element that I already have at my disposal.
Yeah.
And I hear a lot of synth music. So it's like if it's something that's unique that I can bring to the table. When I had first got VCV rack, I mean, I already had. I think it was right before I started getting actual Eurorack stuff. I went and got VCV rack, and it was free, and I got to play with all the kind of mutable instruments modules I was interested in buying already. And so at some point, I decided, well, I'm going to make a whole patch in this, and I did that. And then I thought, well, this is kind of interesting, and it's a little exotic sounding, but I'm going to do a guitar solo in the end of it. And so I did this guitar solo, and then I thought, well, yeah, I mean, it was a quick track and it was sloppy, but I was like, let me post it up, and so I posted it to YouTube, and then to shared the link to some of the VCV Rack Facebook group, and then like within the next week or two, there was all of a sudden all these VCV Rack videos that were showing up with guitar. Right after I had done that, I was rather impressed with it, because like, whoa, I didn't think it was that novel. Like I was like, these are the things that I know, so I'm going to do the things that I know. But then to see other people that like, this is VC Rack, and oh yeah, I have guitars, and never the twain shall meet. And then all of a sudden, these people were starting to do the same thing. I thought, well, that was a fun thing.
I still don't remember ever. I can't recollect a video or demo of anything of Eurorack that included a guitar. Out of all the YouTube videos I've watched, I can't. None of them come to mind. Guitar and Eurorack don't often blend in the synth world,
Yeah,
but
it's not as common. Uh, I got this module, a Strymon AA1 uh, Eurorack module, which you can use a variety of ways, but it basically has inputs and outputs. And then going in, it'll boost by 18 decibels, and going out, it'll drop by 18 decibels. So you can interface like a guitar into Eurorack, or you can bring in. So I've tried that. I've ran my guitar through Eurorack modules. In fact, in the February filter sweep, I ran into a vintage Big Muff Pi fuzz into that module, into I think it was a Polyvox filter, to do a
nice.
filter sweep on the guitar. And then, but I've also used it with hardware effects pedals like Strymon stuff to add to my Eurorack, which has been a nice cost saving measure. But oh, why did I go there? I can't even remember now. Oh, the mixing of stuff. So
Yeah.
I've seen more of it now. In fact, I just saw a guy that was playing a matriarch and a guitar together today on
Okay.
YouTube, but it wasn't interfacing them in the same system. He was just kind of playing both at the same time, where he was doing something on the matriarch and had a patch going. I think he was playing guitar with it. But yeah, you don't see it as much, but I think it'll probably become a little bit more common once
Well, and maybe
people
if
feel
I,
like they have permission to do it.
yeah, that's the psychological element. That's certainly part of it. So I was just thinking about the one of the advantages to the software approach. Obviously, is you can the you can try so many more options, and especially over the last 5 years or so, I'd say the free plugin and free synthesizer world has
Yeah.
improved in
Oh
quality
yeah.
dramatically.
Yeah. There's nobody giving away free effects pedals
Yeah,
that I know
yeah.
of.
But I mean, you like you said, you can get VCV rack and you can try out a whole suite of modules that would cost you like 3 grand to try out in real life.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And
And some of
so
the patches that people are making, if they have a computer, they'll handle it. Like I've got ten
I mean, I
thousand
guess
dollar rigs.
I assume it's can it like stack infinitely. You can have infinite HP, and you just have to scroll the window to
Yeah.
get to all your modules or something.
As long as you have the CPU for it. As far as I know, I don't know if there are any limits. I never tried to reach any limits, but
Yeah,
just seeing some of the videos that people have made, and they're scrolling through this enormous
It's
rack
like
that
a
would,
Krell patch with 2,000 modules or something crazy. It's like, oh yeah, it took
yeah,
me 6 months to make this patch.
yeah, it's nuts. But that's also, like that cost savings has been a pretty big one because when I would, buy effects pedals, I mean, a cheap one, still might be $100. I mean, now that I know, of course, they have got really, like Amazon or and
Ones that I
like
would be embarrassed to show on my
Mower.
desk.
And yeah, there's lots of cheap ones too now, which would have been nice when I first started playing music. But
Yeah,
the type of stuff that I'd buy a lot of times, like, oh, well, here's a Strymon pedal and it's $400 or $500, or a vintage fuzz pedal that could be the same or more. Like, but then in the software world, that's been so wonderful because there's so many interesting things, especially if you get bored or you like to try new things. It gets expensive in hardware, but with software, as you mentioned, there's so many free things coming out or manufacturers offering something free for a
hmm
short amount of time
or demos
that,
even.
yeah, that you get to play and experiment and go, okay, I like this or I like that, I'm going to pick it up. Or it has been, and like I said, that was like basically 2020 for me, was trying a lot of software to see,
Okay.
yeah, what really fits my workflow, what sounds, I mean, I know effects already, but which particular ones are the ones that I'm going to keep reaching to, are most comfortable
Yeah.
to me. You've also had quite a while where you just did stuff in the box, right? Like when you
Yeah.
started.
Yeah. That a full 10 years straight, totally in the box, 100%. Other than recording some vocals every now and then. And I
What was your process like? Because I know when GarageBand came out, that was fantastic. If you're on a Mac, you got so much stuff with it. Even before you
mhm.
buy any of the other packs, it's like, man, I can make any kind of music that I want with this completely free setup. How did you get into other software synthesizers and effects? Like you mentioned, you eventually had picked up Diva. How is the process transitioning from just GarageBand to adding other things in?
I think mainly it started when because I had GarageBand, added a couple expansions to that, and I think all those expansions were solely sample based orchestral instruments, because I was mainly interested in that when I first started. But once I got Logic
Mm-hmm.
and I started doing more industrial music and I was listening to all my favorite albums, I'm like, well, I want to be able to sound like that. And I dig around in Logic, and if I couldn't find it, then I'd start looking elsewhere to see, okay, what's a software synthesizer I can get and sound more like that. So like I picked up the Korg Legacy Collection, forever ago, and I don't even know, 2010, 2011, when
Yeah.
that was pretty new, and that started to, and I think I actually probably picked that up because I saw on the back of a V&V Nation album that I had, he listed the equipment, and there was a few Korg synthesizers on that list. And I think that's why I went and looked for a Korg software synthesizers, not knowing, not ever having seen a Korg synthesizer in real life or knowing what they would sound like. I was like,
Mm-hmm.
well, these sound different. What I different than what I have, so I'll try them. The same thing happened with what is that, Virtual String Machine from GeForce Software. I picked that up way back then.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then I think the one of the other big soft synth collections I got was the V collection. I think V collection 3 was the first one that I had from Arturia,
Yeah.
and that opened things wide up, wide for me. Even though it's funny because back then I didn't know what any of them should sound like, so I didn't know that they were. I understand they've come a long way since then, but back then it was like it was basically a name and a look, but the sound wasn't anywhere near the hardware. But I didn't know any better. I just thought, well, these sound cool, and so it just slowly started to reach out whenever I felt like, or if I'd start a new project, I'm like, okay, I just used all these synthesizers for this album and I spent a year messing with these. I want the new album to sound a little different.
Mm-hmm.
And I still had that attitude about picking, like limiting myself back then. I think after the first couple albums, I learned, okay, if I limit myself, production goes a lot faster because I'm not, okay, which one of these 50 plugins am I going to use on this track? It's like, okay, I'll just pick, five or six, use them for the album, and production goes a lot faster. But at the same time, I'm like, okay, I just used those six for a year or so. Let's maybe pick some new ones and one or two of
Yeah.
the old ones. So it's like end up having this 1 or 2 year cycle where I'd start, look for some new effects, look for some new synthesizers. And since it was all software based, at the most I might spend $500. At the most, that's like getting some 8 DO libraries and some sound toys effects, like the really expensive stuff. Nothing close to the kind of money you're spending on hardware.
Yeah, that tends to be perhaps one of the issues with software because you can acquire so much for your dollar that it does tend to. It seems like online, a lot of people have a hard time self-limiting. So that's something that you have been very successful on. And I would say in most areas of my life, that's pretty me. Like, let's just like narrow it down here and just figure out what's the thing that really works. But then I have this like music part of me that is so crazy and scattered. Like, oh, I want to try that. Oh, I want to try that. That thing is 1.5% better. I got to try that one, and to kind of go through these cycles. And that's where a lot of our friends are at, and and me, and like, oh, this new, and but the thing is that like you have to, if you know that is like the way that you're wired, you do have to have that kind of self restraint, and or even to begin to have the awareness that you have that problem. uh I mean, it's not always a problem because sometimes you get stale and you need to have the ability to go, like you said, you would do after a year. You're like, okay, I've done these set of plugins really well. I'm
Mhm.
going to go to a new set, but I'm also going to include a couple of my favorites that will kind of even things out. And I've kind of been working that in a similar way. So 2020 brought in a lot of new plugins. I mean, I probably got 15 or 20 for free. So
Mm.
there's, without any money spent. And then there was stuff that I really needed, and some things that I just really wanted. And so then, part of my approach has been like, okay, well, it's so easy to get lost. And there's still like, when I look through my plugin list, it's gotten pretty big. And I forget there's things in there that I had purchased, like, oh, that thing was really cool. Like I should probably start using that. And I forgot I even had it, which is
Yeah.
kind of a funny
Yeah.
thing because with hardware, you well, I mean, I know people who have so much stuff that they can forget, but
Yeah.
I I have a good sized collection of stuff, but I'm not at that extent that I'd be like, oh, I forgot I had that guitar or I had that pedal or something or that synthesizer. Like, no, I'm pretty aware of what I have, but when it comes to plugins, then you go, it's lost in some menu on your DAW
Yeah.
that like. But that could be kind of fun too because you're scrolling through and you're doing the same old thing, and then you find something that you forgot you had, and you're like, oh, I don't even have to spend any money because it's already there.
Yeah. Yeah. That's, I mean, and I feel like in the software realm, I've been there a few times where I'm like, okay, I got everything that I like. It sounds good. Because, like you said, whenever I finish a project, I go on this little exploration journey, and I might spend a month or two exploring stuff. And there's been a few times where I maybe bought one thing and maybe barely used it because the stuff I had was like, it was really great. And it's, which that may be one of the things I was just thinking from a software development perspective. At some point, how can you make an Echo plugin better than every other echo or delay plugin that's ever existed. It's like maybe just make a purple one, and it'll sell because it's purple. You know, I imagine these are what these people that make these plugins have to deal with. Is like, well, you know, Echo Boy is really amazing, and the what is that, he delay or whatever it's called is really great. You know, those are two that I really like. But it's like, how do you make something that would make somebody who uses those reach for your plugin instead? That's that's got to be a tough uphill challenge there.
Yeah, I saw it with the in the effects pedals market happen where you start in the 60s with very basic fuzz and wah pedals, in the 70s pretty much the same thing. Towards the late 70s things start opening up and you have chorus and phalangers
Mm,
and overdrive pedals, and things become, and delay pedals using bucket brigade devices. And to the 80s the technology keeps driving
yeah,
it forward, so there's always an increase where, like, now you're getting these fancy digital delays and digital reverbs, or your even tides. And then it hits kind of like the pinnacle of that time, and then in the early 90s grunge comes in and says, screw you to all of that stuff. And then all of a sudden it's like this, you know technical reversion back to the classics, and you're back to fuzz pedals and old amps and things like that. And then what was interesting was the next kind of evolution of it, because by the mid 90s people were buying up, and the vintage gear, it kind of skyrocketed a lot earlier than synthesizers did. And so people were buying up vintage guitars, vintage effects pedals, and these guys were like, hey, they really like these old circuits, like the fuzz face
mm-hmm,
and the tube screamer, or the Bossy E1 chorus, or stuff like that. And so they started making copies of those, clones of them, modified clones. Like, here's a tube screamer circuit, but you, instead of just diodes, you have LEDs to clip, or JFETs to clip on a switch, or we modified it to have more bass or more drive. And it really did become like that thing. Like, there were so many, like a very, like, the probably one of the most common pedals would be like the tube screamer, this Ibanez pedal that everybody, Stevie Ray Vaughan and everybody else has used. And when it hit the boutique market and people were making these clones and just tweaking the circuit, it really became a kind of a funny thing, because there were such minimal differences between this one and the next one.
mm-hmm.
And a lot of it came down to, just as you were saying, like, well, this one looks really cool. So, like, we were getting these um, uh, just plain metal boxes that people are building them into, and then they were getting the fancy paint jobs. And then one guy's like, well, these are all solid colors. So one guy was starting to spray paint them in sunburst, like an old guitar or something. Like, oh, that's that, again, not that much different in sound, but same thing. Like, if you can have something that appeals to the aesthetic nature,
Mm-hmm.
or if it, like in plugins, if it looks like the hardware, or if now it looks like an old piece of hardware and it's got the chips out of it and the scratches and
Yeah,
the dirt, and
there you go.
like, well, that doesn't affect the sound at all, but it affects the user experience of using it.
Yeah, no, that's a very very fun topic. Aesthetics and skeuomorphism and all those different. Skeuomorphism is the only fancy word I know that involves all that, but
Yeah. One question that, or one kind of subtopic of this that I had thought about, was in terms of maintenance.
hmm,
Like, how do you think hardware and software maintenance compares? Because obviously, if you're investing into something, um, there's a there's nothing that is just perpetually the same. You need to maintain it, whether it's a piece of hardware or software, a computer. How would you feel those compare between hardware and software,
yeah. So then
or
I
has it
was
been
I
your
was
experience?
I was thinking about that prior to our conversation because that that fits right into the hybrid approach. There's considerations there. You know, and I don't. Well, I've even though I've only been using hardware for a couple of years, I've still had a few pieces of hardware have problems or just fail, which in my opinion, if something fails after 3 to 6 months, that's a manufacturer defect. No, nothing should fail that quickly. But depending on the hardware, and I'd say in a lot of cases, I guess it depends on how it fails. If it's okay, this is a brick now, and I can't do anything with it. And if it's hardware and you don't have a lot of hardware, that means you have to replace that brick with something else. So that might cost you anywhere from $500 to $1,500, depending on what it is that bricked on you, and that can
Yeah.
be a serious problem to everything you're doing. Whereas with software, there's so many alternatives. And I don't think I've ever had. I mean, maybe if your computer fails, but
Well, there has
the
been times where certain software has been discontinued after um, computer upgrades,
yeah, that's what I'm
OS
thinking. The
upgrades.
main hassle with me for software has been whenever the operating system upgraded, and that was always more of a problem on the Mac side for me than it was on the Windows side,
Mhm.
because for some reason, Apple just wants to update their OS more often, and for some reason it tended to break plugins on me, and that was very frustrating. And I've that problem has been very diminished on the Windows side, maybe just because they use Windows 10 for 5 years or whatever, and then they go to whatever's after 10, and it's a little
Mhm.
different structure there. But I've found reliability wise, software may actually have beaten out hardware just in the 2 years experience I've had using a lot of hardware. And I've also learned with hardware, you get what the more money you spend, usually the better the equipment is, the more reliable it is. But still, like you and Jamie experienced, you can go out and drop 3 grand on a synthesizer, and it may not be really finished.
Yeah.
Which I would be very upset. I'd just send something back immediately if that happened to me. I'm like, okay, this is ridiculous. You guys don't know what you're doing. Let me know when you figure it out, because you know, I just wouldn't have the patience of, like, if I spend that kind of money, I want to be able to put it on the desk and produce stuff with it, as soon as I learn how to use it. So it's an
Yeah.
interesting topic.
It's funny. Yeah. I mean, with the software side of it, uh, probably. So I'm on an Apple computer, a MacBook, and Big Sur actually has gone pretty easy for me. Like
Hmm.
I did finally upgrade a couple of weeks ago, and it's funny that the small companies that have a few employees are putting out updates that make them compatible within weeks or days, and the large companies like Roland or Korg or companies like that, IK Multimedia, they're taking months. And I'm thinking, you have all the resources. All it
Hmm.
takes is somebody to say, hey, yeah, you have a big library, but you also have the employees to take care of it. And that's been kind of a frustration for me. But fortunately, this update went pretty smoothly and I haven't had any major issues. But I'm thinking, like, the software on hardware is where I've had more issues. And I've had it with Dave Smith instruments, and I've had it, a lot with the Moog One. Um, I knew when I bought the Moog One that there would be quite a time of getting things right, and it's such an impressive undertaking that they had. I mean, it was 5 years of development before they even released it. I think it got released early because they needed money, to be honest. But it was such a fantastic thing, and when the presets or their demos were terrible, like presets, the factory stuff is junk. It's like, why waste your time on that? But when they did the live streams, when the Amos Gaines who's like the lead guy on the project, you go, here, let me just start with an init patch and start dialing something. It was mind blowing. What a great synthesizer. It has so much, such an amazing sound, and they clearly thought through the user interface on it. But I also knew like this is going to be buggy as heck for a while because this is probably too early of a release.
Yeah.
And it was, and there's been problems along the way, and some things have gotten fixed. There were some tuning problems for a while, and now like I'm not having tuning problems with it, but there's still
Mm.
quite a few bugs in it. And I think one of the things that I've had a hard time with it, because I mean this is a piece of hardware, so the advantage is that uh, even as it is, like is incredible, is capable of absolutely incredible, mind blowing sounds. And again, the GUI is all done, so it's brilliant. It's the best GUI of any or user interface of any synthesizer I've ever played or I've ever seen. It's so quick and easy, despite having so many knobs and such a complex routing system. It is beyond brilliant. And then you're having to kind of deal with the priorities of the company because whatever it is, if it's Windows or Apple, or if it's
Yeah.
Dave Smith or Moog, because they had a lot of updates at first and they were getting a lot of feedback from the community. But for the last year and a half, it's been very quiet. We've had, I think, maybe one update in that time. And that's kind of a bummer because you've got this really expensive piece of hardware that is still very fantastic sounding, but you want them to kind of fix the things that annoy you about it, and also to add the features that you know that they're developing. So that's kind of been a source of frustration as far as the software on hardware goes. Or this latest Dave Smith update, they got a beta, and so okay, we know it's a beta and it's not going to work perfectly, but you should at least be able to load it onto your synthesizer. And I spent probably 6 hours, or no, more than that. I don't know. It was a ridiculous amount of time that I shouldn't have done, but I was so interested to try out their new vintage knob function, but on my
Mm.
OB6,
Oh,
that I
okay.
was loading it, and like, well, here it is. So I've done multiple updates with it, and you plug the USB cable into it and into your computer, and you load the stuff, and it's a little bit archaic because you're having to do sysx, and you have to use some third party program. They don't offer you anything to do the update. Like,
Yeah.
so my couple $100 Arturia Microfreak, Arturia gives you software. You plug in the USB and it says, okay, do you want to upgrade this? And you hit the button and it does it. And Dave Smith, you've bought a very expensive synthesizer. I don't know what the OB6 is new. I think it's like about $3,000, but
Yeah.
I got mine used, but still a couple grand, let's say 2 grand, and it's not working over USB. Oh, well, then you've got to try the bootloader and try using MIDI DIN. And then you got to try to slow the rate and all this kind of like
Yeah.
chaotic stuff. Like, why doesn't it work? Why haven't we figured, why can't you release an update that works? And then they finally said, oh, it's not working on the keyboard version. Well, that's what I have. And then, of course, they went quiet for like a couple of weeks until the point where they decided like to just quietly release it, another beta update, and all of a sudden it works perfectly. Now I know it wasn't, because what I got teased by people like, well, maybe you're not doing it right. Like, I've done this so many times before. And then so the Prophet 6 I made the sound set for, my buddy brought it over, and we update it, bam, just like that, no problem, same exact system that I have. And so why didn't it work? Well, it was up to the company, and they evidently wrote something wrong in the code or whatever that wasn't working for this particular OB6 keyboard. And lots of other people were having the same problem too. So that can be kind of a frustration that's shared between the purely software world. Like if we're talking plugins, like, oh, something is broken and this is not working in the software synth, but also it can happen with these nice hardware synths. Now, one thing I like about software that I've had to deal with an enormous amount in hardware for maintenance is like components, failing or going bad. And I mean, that's how I made a living from music, but my gear money all came from um, repairing gear and buying and selling. And so, like, having to deal with that, and thank goodness it saved me a lot of money and made me a lot of money. But I know a lot of people, like, with when they have to take their amp or their synthesizer into a tech, it's a lot of money. It's a lot of money, even for a simple mod, for changing some pickups out or something. That's expensive, but like when something happens with your amplifier and they got to diagnose it and figure it out, I mean, you're talking, bench time and $60 an hour or something, and
Mm-hmm.
just for somebody else to figure it out, you're like, you're just watching your money go out. Like, my equipment's broken, and I'm just like giving lots and lots of money to somebody to fix it. That can be a pretty frustrating thing, at least with software. When your favorite soft synth isn't working on the latest OS, it's just a matter of time, unless the company goes under. But usually, it's just a matter of time before they figure out the problem and they provide you a fix, and you're not out any money for it. Whereas with the hardware, you know, or like when I got my second Juno 106, like, oh, this is great. I really wanted to have my first synthesizer was a Juno 106. And so it had been years since I'd had one. And so when I was getting back into synthesizers, I bought this one, and it was like great. It had been uh, new buttons on it. The faders had been cleaned,
Wow.
and the voice cards had been serviced. So I was like, well, that's a lot of work I didn't want to deal with. I could have done it, but I didn't want to deal with it. And then I'm playing it and going through it, and I'm like, wait, this is the filter is not tracking right. And so when you would push it in the resonance and you would like key track it
Yeah.
to play, use the filter as an oscillator, it was way out of tune. And so I hadn't ever worked on a synthesizer. I'd done, I'd rebuilt guitar amps and stuff, and like, I don't know anything about this, but I don't want to drop $200 to go how somebody tuned this. So it took a long time to do that. I mean, at least with the experience I had before, like I just knew it was going to be a matter of hours that I would have to spend. So I did have to buy an oscilloscope, and then I had to, open up. I had to do the research online to figure it out, and then to, sit and tune it and tweak it and measure it. And the oscilloscope and you're tuning trim pots, and then you're going back and doing the same process again because something wasn't exactly right. And it just ends up getting, that's one area that I find extremely frustrating, even
Yeah.
though repairs, like I've done it out of necessity because I was, just for a long time just didn't have a lot of money to do stuff. So particularly when I started in my teens or 20s, like I had no other way to do it. And back in those days I didn't, fortunately my parents had a neighbor that was great into electronics that kind of would help me out on some of those early projects because there was no internet for me to use to figure this stuff out. But even when there was, it still just is such a chore to like, it's broken. Damn it. I'm going to have to figure out how to fix it.
You,
you
yeah.
know?
You don't have a spare 106 laying around the house.
Yeah. It's not like, I'll just won't use that until Roland fixes it or upgrades it. Like it would, like if it were the software version.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, I'm stuck with an expensive piece of vintage gear unless I fix it.
So, from our conversation, it sounds to me like you are certainly using the hybrid approach. Um, and I guess
Yeah.
you've never really been totally software anyway. I mean, I would say the hybrid approach is ideal for a long list of reasons. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe would you say did you arrive at the hybrid approach out of a combination of maybe necessity and convenience? I mean, you've never done full hardware, and why haven't you done, full hardware?
Yeah. So, well, I guess in some areas, so within guitar and bass, yeah, I've done full hardware. Like that's, when I wanted to play guitar, I would turn a tube amp on and turn my pedal board on and wait for the tubes to warm up and start playing. And
Yeah.
or if I'd go gig, it was no computers involved, it was just effects pedals and amps. And so in that way, yeah, like it took a while for the computer to be the center of my focus as far as recording, but I always felt like I wanted to get to that point, because I wasn't. And when I really started to dive into the synth world, I always felt like I have this affinity for this hardware and for kind of the classic synthesizer designs and all the warm tones that you and I both love. Um, but I felt like the recording process was something that I didn't want to go back to having to deal with hardware.
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and the pinnacle of recording sound is all hardware. It's like, well, you can have an API or a Neve or SSL board and a Studer tape machine, and like that's just a brilliantly good sounding. But if you spend any time in those situations, it's also a complete pain. I mean, especially with the tape machine, and to think about like splicing and editing and the kind of stuff that it happens in seconds in a DAW. It takes so much time that I really do appreciate that we can have a hybrid approach with things, because there are some things that are just so much easier in the box, in on a computer, in the digital realm. But I love, hardware, and I love analog, and so to be able to work with them both together has been really a pleasure for me. Um, I may have drifted off topic there a little bit. Well, bring me back to the question again.
Well, I was just asking generally, you've been doing basically a hybrid approach, but I wondered if you had ever even thought about doing solely a hardware approach at any point. And I
Oh,
think you kind
yeah.
of answered the question.
Yeah. Yeah. Never had the desire to do, as far as like electronic music and
It's
synthesizers,
like you
never
haven't
had a
done
desire to do a
any sort of
purely.
DAWless jam type setup at all, have you?
Um, I, so, well, I don't have a tape machine uh, right now to do it, but I have done a couple of, you know, essentially DAWless jams, but at the end point had to be recorded on a DAW because that's all I
Yeah.
have. And so I had done, when I had gotten the Eurorack together. I did try to, like, I want to make something that was, even though I love the ambient kind of self-generative music, I wanted to see if I could make my rack do something that approached what I would consider like a more traditional styles of music. And so I did a couple tracks where I did it all live, or one track was like most of it was coming from drum machine, Euro rack for the bass and rhythm parts, and then there was some parts that I would play like a lead part. So I overdubbed later, or tracked later on different synthesizers that I had. So it was kind of like
Okay.
a mix. So I have done it, but I don't really find a lot of enjoyment in it.
Hmm.
Again, I love listening to it. Um, you know, one of the friends online here, Tim Grogan, like he's a drummer, and so he kind of has a similar like background where he's in Nashville and has done a lot of drum work there, and so for a variety of musical styles. And then
Yeah.
he's got this setup, you've seen, he's got his Moog synthesizers and his
Amazing.
OB6. Yeah, and he makes this great music, and it's a live jam where he's adding, some live keyboard parts with stuff that's going on with the Euro rack and with his other sequence bass lines and things, and that's interesting. I love hearing that, but for the amount of time that I have and for what I want to accomplish, like it's not usually where I go. And so part of me that like has not been online, and where some of my passion has been, is like I've been doing instrumental music, and I've been doing a lot of weird stuff just because I'm experimenting right now. The last few years have been a big experiment.
Mm-hmm.
But what the kind of music that means the most to me is stuff that's lyrically driven, that has that makes you think or puts you in a certain place emotionally, that um, that just changes your head in a way. And I feel like uh, songwriters and lyricists that do that, I just really enjoy that. And I wasn't a large listener to instrumental music until more recently. Like I wouldn't listen to a whole lot of the guitar shredders or something that did instrument, some Yngwie Malmsteen or Steve Vai or something. Like I would casually listen to it at times, but um, these kind of Dawless type jam, or even compositions, like where I think about some of the music that you make, that you have thought out. Like a lot of the stuff that we see online is like very
Yeah.
improvisational. But where I see, well, one of the things that attracts me to your music, and with Point Surrender and Perfect, is that, yeah, you were during that time where you went Dawless, you were working out every single thing uh, to come up with this beautiful composition of a song that worked together. And you were, I guess the way that I would describe it is that it was very much like a traditional, or at least the result. I don't know what the process was, but the result was like traditional songwriting. Like these are the parts, and here's kind of part A, part B, or here's maybe a bridge, and it has a flow, and here's the arc of the song, which a lot of jamming music doesn't have.
Yeah.
And I like that. I like that aspect of it. So I'm not good enough at the kind of Dawless jamming, and by not good of it, by saying I'm not good enough at it, is more of a statement about the time that I've spent on it more than the propensity to be able to do it.
Yeah.
And that's the thing for me. It's like, so that's why I don't spend. I suspect that, like, once I retire or something, and I have a lot more time to do things, like maybe at that point, or maybe as I become elderly and my hands don't work as well as they should, that I would spend a lot more time with things like modular synthesis and that kind of stuff. But what about you?
Well, I'll just be brief. We're getting on in time, but after doing totally in the box, totally outside the box, ultimately the reason why I went from the completely hardware to a little more back into the box, was because I was running into some all audio quality issues that you just don't run into at all when you're in the box.
Hmm.
Because I was, recording synths and pedals, and some of the pedals are a little more noisy, and there's gain staging issues there. And I ran into
Yeah.
some problems that I didn't realize were even there
Hmm.
until I was submitting the soundtrack to the what is that, the Unreal game store or whatever, one of those game services that I sell the soundtracks through, and they're like, everything's great except there's a noise issue. And it took me a while to even hear the noise, and then I was like, okay, how do I deal with that? Thankfully,
Hmm.
RX7 is like black
Oh
magic.
yeah.
It just works. It should not work as well as it works. I don't know how it works the way it does, but it's insanely good. This show is not endorsed or sponsored by RX7, whatever. What is that company? I can't even remember the name of the company.
Isotope.
Isotope. There we
Isotope.
go.
Yeah.
Not a paid endorsement, but and I was like, well, okay, I understood how I arrived at that noise floor in the first place, but yeah, I just started to think, that the flexibility is nice, but well, everything I do, I think about, okay, why am I doing this? What do I want to accomplish here? I never come in here and just screw around to screw around. It's like my brain, I think it's just because of the way I was raised. I don't really have the capacity. It's like, well, if I'm going to play a video game, I'm going to screw around. But if I'm in the studio, I'm like, okay, what's my next project? Okay, what do I want to figure something out? I'm not going to be in here just messing around. So I'm always looking at the tools, like, okay, what's the most efficient way to get there if I'm only using hardware? And I just decided, that the end product was, the final mixing and mastering process. I mean, there are certain things that I simply could not do without a computer, like getting the levels right, clipping the songs so they would loop seamlessly. I mean, yeah, I could do that with hardware, but that would be really hard.
Yeah, it
Uh,
took a lot of time.
I mean, and the Deluge wasn't really well suited for that, just the way that it's made. So I did end up, even with the totally hardware setup for the final mastering, I had to do it in a DAW to nail some of that stuff down. So I'm like, well, if I've got to maintain a DAW anyway, why not just, put the DAW back in the studio and let the DAW do what the DAW does best and let the hardware do what the hardware does best. And so that's where I've arrived where the DAW basically handles the sequencing and the effects, but the hardware sounds fantastic and it's interactive enough that I don't feel like I'm going insane sitting in front of a computer and pushing a mouse all day.
Uh-huh.
And I found, having owned enough modern pedals, sure, there's some pedals like the Rubberneck that's an analog BBD delay that just sounds amazing. But for most everything else, they're essentially digital. They're essentially plugins in a pedal anyway. Like all the Strymon stuff, it's all whatever
Yeah.
the Shark processor. I can't remember. They really, promote their DSP technology. But you can have a plugin and it sounds the exact same. The key seems to be that you started with analog hardware as the source, and then you can run
Yeah.
that through all sorts of plugins, good, bad, expensive, cheap, and it still sounds better to me than a software synthesizer would sound. And I avoid, the noise issues. Is much harder to accumulate when the only noisy source you may have is the synthesizer you started with. You don't have the pedal noise, the, various amplifiers, your mixer, all that kind of stuff. You can just avoid that altogether. And,
But and it's interesting that like when you buy some effects or particularly like channel strip plugins, that some of them that I bought recently, that things that I've been experimenting with, because we go so far into the digital world, then you want to bring back some of the analog into it, and so things like modeled hardware, like vintage soundboards. So I said before, like got some stuff that was like replicating the sound of an old SSL and Neve
mm-hmm.
and API boards, and they have a parameter on there for noise in there because at some point it becomes so clean that our
Yeah,
ears aren't used to hearing that. Or yeah,
I end up putting soft tube tape on a whole lot of stuff because you can
yeah,
just, make it sound like it doesn't sound quite right. It's like, I don't want it to sound pristine and ultra clean. That's got to have a little warmth and grit in there, but it's better to be in a position where you can add that than in a position where you're
yes,
trying to get rid of it.
yep, yep.
That because I was worried for a while there with one of those projects, like, am I going to have to, just chuck this to the side? I mean, it's not a pretty place to be. So it's like, okay, I got to reevaluate what I'm doing here. And so, so
Yeah, and one of the wonderful things about software is that they keep improving the quality of it. So, the increase in sound quality for effects and for software synthesizers and for all sorts of plugins has been pretty amazing to me. I mean, it used to be that most, my experience, especially once GarageBand came out, and probably the time that I switched to Logic and I started really paying attention to different plugins and
That
started
was a
buying
big step
stuff.
up. I remember when I switched from GarageBand to Logic, I was like, wow, this is worth every penny that I paid. Like I could actually
Yeah.
hear the
Oh,
difference.
yeah. And then to think about what kind of plugins were out at the time, 10 years ago, even, there wasn't the kind of plugins that were out were either really expensive, um, or, a lot of them just didn't sound that great. And, one area that I've been paying attention to would be, guitar amp modeling
Hmm.
and the first digital, guitar amps and like the Line 6 pod that came out in the 90s. Like they just weren't that great sounding, and the early versions of Amplitude, like I so like the idea of this, but in reality it just does not sound that great. And so I continue to use my hardware amps and mic them up, and there's a lot less flexibility. And I know people say, well, you got to commit to the tone, but like, eh, I still like the flexibility of it. I'll commit at some point, but um, to be able to plug in and do stuff and recall settings in my favorite setup, I don't have to go over here over and measure things out or angles and all that kind of stuff. Like I just have it saved and I recall it as a preset. But the difference in the quality of these different plugins like amp modelers has changed radically.
Hmm.
And so Amplitude, which is the main guitar amp software that I use, has come so far that the amount of time, I mean, back when I first started recording, it was almost all, miking up my real amplifiers. And then now till 2021, probably, 95% of the time I'm in the box with, I'm plugging my guitar into a hardware compressor and then it's going to my interface, but then it's amplitude and, channel strips and Valhalla delay and reverb and things like that. It's all there, and it's made life so much better that my recording process is much quicker. Like to get some of these amplifiers sounding really great, you turn them up, but then like your neighbors are hearing you and
Yeah.
they're not happy about it.
Yeah.
And so to be able to do it in the box where I've just got it at, a, a, a rational listening level is a great thing too. And of course, the accuracy of these models and software, since, I think Yuhi was one of the ones that I remember is like really sounding phenomenal, like to getting to the point where you're like, I kind of wish they made this in hardware.
Oh yeah.
Whereas before, like, those first synthesizers you're getting in GarageBand or even those old ones in Logic where you kind of use them, but they never really gave you the feeling of hardware. But now some of the upgrades that have happened and, the newest, the even when I got the Arturia Collection 6 and I was like,
Hmm.
when it came out, I was like, it was my first experience with like, this I like the idea of it, but it's maybe not quite there. And then now version 8's out and they've redone some more things. I'm like, wow, this is getting really good.
Hmm.
Or Roland Cloud, same way where,
Yeah.
I've got a Juno 106, but the System 8 and the Roland Cloud, like, man, I don't have to deal with some of the issues that I have, like, and I don't have to maintain it, and it's already here. I don't have to reroute things. It's like, and the sound, like when you're playing back recordings, you're getting so close to the sound of some of the hardware. I mean, there's always things like, why would you spend, a massive amount of money on some cool piece of hardware if software does everything. And I don't think software does everything, but I think the trend is that they're getting so good with as processing power increases. And if the company will then take the time to make use of that and modeling things that, I mean, before I imagined they were just starting off like, okay, if we can make the EQ curve of this the same, and we'll, just the basic parts of it. And you're like, well, that kind of reminds me of it, but it's not really exact. But
Yeah.
now they're doing component modeling and doing things like, well, it's not even just the schematic of something that they're using, like a guitar amp or a synthesizer. Like, we need to figure out what the capacitance is in the circuit, like, like the straight capacitance of like two tracks, two traces running right next to each other. There's some parasitic capacitance happening. Well, that's affecting the signal in some way, or this harmonic distortion that a transformer has. Like, the level of detail that are getting to these days is really incredible. And I keep wondering, like, is there going to be a point where we're like, we don't really need analog anymore? I'm trying. I'm trying to imagine, but I assume we're going to get there, and probably sooner than we think.
That's a good question. Um, I would say during the couple months that I've been building my secret weapon, I've been in the box and I've been using the UVI Vintage Vault, which
Uh huh.
it's literally sampled hardware. It sounds really good. The architecture is fairly simplified. The filters I don't care for at all. It's basically more like a volume, but the raw tone is there. But at the same time, I felt my creative energy slowly evaporate because when I was in the box, I put out an album maybe every 2 or 3 years, and it was like pulling blood from a stone for most of those.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got hardware, and that all changed in a matter of weeks. Of like, I I don't know, just something about hardware sparks my creativity to where I may need a break for 3 weeks after I finish a project, and then I'm ready to hit the ground running again. And it just churns out, and I don't know where it's coming from, and it just keeps coming like a geyser. And spending the last 2 months, it's like, so even if the tone is there for the software, for me, there's something about the interaction with the physical space
Yeah.
that I just don't get with hardware. And sitting in front of that screen, pushing that mouse, no matter how good it sounds, it can't make up for that tactile experience and also the exploration that comes, especially with something like Eurorack, where you're like, well, let's plug this into there, see what happens. And suddenly you're like, you hear the sound and it sounds like an animal, and you're like, I need to make an ambient track right now with that sound in there, just as an
Yeah.
example.
Yeah.
So it's like, but like you say with the Roland stuff, especially, like I got the SH2 Roland plugin. That
Uh-huh.
one can stand toe to toe with anything in the UVI Vintage Vault, and it's a software synthesizer, but it sounds amazing. That's probably the best one. The next would be like the System One software synthesizer. I've got that one too, and that one can hold up to the UVI stuff in a mix, and you don't hear like, okay, that's clearly analog, okay, that's clearly digital. It's like, no, they can be toe to toe and they can mix well. So I mean, I think in many ways we're already there, and it's only going to get better. But
Yeah.
for me, it if I can be more creative and have more enjoyment with the hardware is just going to stay around.
Yeah. I mean, that's where there's a complexity into what's going to produce the results.
Yeah.
Where it's not just purely one thing, like, oh, it's all about the tone. Well, no, because the experience, the user experiences, and then again, it's not a everybody's not going to be the same, because some things are going to work for some people and some things for others. And we've got friends that when I see how they do things, when I think about Andrew or Lisa or something, like their their workflow is so radically different from mine, and I would not want their workflow,
Yeah.
but their
Yeah.
music is good. And I listen to it and I see them play, and I'm like, man, that is really good. And I have, I don't want to say I don't have any idea what's going on, but I don't understand how. I understand how they're making the music, but I don't understand why that appeals to them in such a way. But I can't argue with the results because it
Yeah.
sounds good. And again, it comes down to our brain wiring and how we like things. Because I imagine they would say the exact same thing about the way that I do things. Like,
Oh
oh,
yeah.
geez, that must, like, I don't know why you do it that way. Why would you want to do it that way? Like, oh, well, it works for me. I like it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll put a pin in that conversation for now. Yeah, I we just barely scratched the surface.
Oh yeah.
It's an extremely large, broad topic.
But a fun one, a very fun
Oh
one to
yeah.
think about, and
Yeah.
certainly something that we think about quite often, especially now. I mean, we wouldn't have had this, we didn't have this problem 20 years ago. At least I didn't. Like I was not thinking about software and what to do in the in a computer. It was like all about hardware. But now it's interesting how things change and they evolve, and we've got both some really great evolution in both software and hardware now,
Hmm.
and the combination of the two. I mean, the Mug One is an excellent example of that. Where hitting it from two different directions, like this this has a great analog engine that's that's the core of everything, but the digital brain is really doing some
Oh
amazing
yeah.
thing, and it's quite revolutionary in how it's doing it. But yeah, I'm very optimistic about what the future brings for musicians.
Yeah. Yeah. I think after spending the last couple of years just trying all sorts of different ways to implement hardware, the best thing I can say is there's tools out there for anybody to find just about their ideal workflow. I mean, we
Yeah,
don't have whatever Elon Musk is working on that allows you to think something and have it happen on the device. We're not there yet, but if you use your fingers, we are there for all intents and purposes. It's just a matter of you trying things and exploring and figuring out, okay, this is my ideal workflow. And because there's just so many options that, it's all, it's an exciting time. That's for sure.
yeah, and if we learn anything, we would probably recognize that something, even when that's possible to think and make things music happen, that's not going to be the best workflow for everybody. That'll be the best
Hmm.
workflow for some people, and then other people, like, it'll be still like turning knobs, and they're going to enjoy that aesthetic of manipulating a piece of hardware or whatever. So even then, like, there's still going to be that diversity in how music is made.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Chris, what are you working on now, and what do you got up in the immediate future going on?
Yeah, still just plugging away at, no pun intended there, at continuing to make patches. I love doing it. I'm so slow at it because I just enjoy the process, and I'll make stuff and then I'll keep going over it and going over it. Most of the patches made pretty quickly, and it's that last like 5% that
Hmm.
I'm like tweaking, and like I want to be artistically beautiful.
Then you listen to it a day later, and you're like, "What was I thinking?"
Yeah, you got to go and change some stuff, and it's very much like recording, because you might think the sound of it's good, but then you come back with fresh ears the next day and you're like, oh, okay, I was hitting the treble a little bit hard there, so I need to pull things back, or whatever. I think sound design whether it's synthesizer patches or recording a song is very similar, the same kind of thing. So yeah, keep on doing that, and trying to find the time to continue to make music. And as I said, like I have for quite a while basically abandoned the things that would be most personal and most traditional to my music making. And so, I mean, I would love to return to writing that kind of music, but for the moment, I'm having fun, and I feel like rather lighthearted about it. So when I think as a performing musician, I had to be very versatile, and so I had to learn a lot of styles. And so on the guitar, whether I was leading a band or being a lead guitarist or some combination of that, um, had to find ways to make what I was playing fit that music, and I always really enjoyed that. And so I think it's maybe been a little more subconscious, but when I make songs, I put them up on YouTube now. I'm kind of putting myself into an uncomfortable situation that I've got to work myself out of. And so as I'm buying new plugins or buying new hardware or whatever, and I'm experimenting, I'm like, why don't I try making this track of a genre that I don't really know that well. But in that process, it's a learning
Cocktail music.
experience. What's that?
Cocktail music.
Cocktail music. I while I'm blaspheming acid by putting guitars in it and things like that. or but I just been having fun and making quirky music that is like I think in that process where before at my music making I was so directioned, like I've got to make this and it's got to be like this, that I'm purposely trying to push against that a little bit and go, just kind of go crazy and do something unusual that's not really, it doesn't have to reflect on you, it doesn't have to be the music that you're like gonna die for.
Hmm.
This is what I love. It's like it's quirky, so it's a mix of things, and I've been enjoying it. And in that process also, as I've gathered a lot of hardware and software, and particularly software, I'm trying to put it into use. And this is something that I've talked about a lot. Like I don't want it just to be I'm collecting, I'm collecting, I'm collecting. I want to be using it, because through the use of it, and you certainly exemplified this, that as you had that year of those plugins or that hardware, that you would learn it. Like that's been probably a little bit wider in the way that I'm doing it and not as deep. But for now, that's what I've got to do. And then later on, when I return, like when I come back from this, kind of journey of doing this, of experimentation, and I've learned all these new things, then I can go back to doing what's comfortable, with the added benefit of like this experience of going on to these other genres and stuff, and bringing the best bits of them back with me to the music that I love to make. So yeah, what about you? What are you working on?
I was just gonna say it. It sounds what you were talking about there. Um, I'm familiar with the process, which is a process I went through a long time ago because I've been on the music production journey a little longer than you. But if you listen to my
Mm-hmm.
older work, there's a whole lot more variety there. A lot more styles
Mm,
blending, and it's slowly coalesced over time into something that's more uniquely my own, and has more of an overall clarity to it, I would say. And it's a natural process, I would say, for any, I would assume, for any artist. It's like, okay, you're just going to
yeah.
dabble around, and as you're doing that, you're going to improve everything about production, whether it's you're making concepts into something, or powering through some sort of blockage that you might have, improving all your mixing, mastering, composition, flow, your efficiency with your tool set, everything. You're feeling it out, you're improving it, because you're learning as you're going along. So I think it's going to all come together for you. You just keep doing what you're doing, and
Yeah,
as
you know,
soon as you want
the
to do
one
a
thing that's been
collaboration, let me know.
oh, right away, right away. You know, the thing that I miss because in my music world right now, and even before COVID, like I had taken kind of a shift in what I was doing. I was no longer working as a musician, so um, my musical experience changed a lot. But the thing that I missed was the working with other musicians, and it allowed me to be a specialist.
Hmm.
And so I knew my thing, and I knew it really well, inside and out. And now I've had to become like I've had to learn all these other aspects, and for being a performing musician, like the kind of stuff that I did, I had to do a lot of different things in that world. So sometimes I was teaching sound man, and then sometimes I was arranging songs. Sometimes I just got to play lead guitar. But in all those circumstances, you're always working with people. And here in my studio here, it's just me working by myself, especially with COVID and times that I might have somebody else to come in and record and do something with. Like that's kind of been put off, so it's been a bummer. So I would look forward. We got to start figuring out like what we will do and how this will work. I don't know. I have no idea, but I would love, you know, for you to think about it, and I'll think about it, and we got to do something.
Yeah, yeah. I've got some ideas. We can correspond over the emails about that.
Awesome.
So, uh, yeah, for me, I'm should tomorrow. Hopefully, the last of the modules for my secret weapon will arrive, and I can put that together. And I've got plenty of tracks that I want to do with that because I've been in a kind of a transition. I finished some projects, and then I was in the reevaluating phase, like we talked about, and I've done a few tracks for some projects that I want to do, but I was like, the tools I'm using, I tried using the UVI vintage vault stuff, and it sounds good, but I'm like, I don't think I want to do a whole album with this stuff just because the workflow is just I just start to get heavier and heavier and heavier, and I don't want to feel like that. I just want it to
Yeah.
flow. So yeah, there'll be lots there to see, and got I'm really liking doing these synth hours with the talks. So I've got some other people I'm going to contact too, and of course you're welcome on anytime, and I'm sure I'll have Marshall on again. He's a hoot. So
Yeah, I love the one that you did with Marshall already. That was great.
yeah, that was a lot of fun. So let's see, and you're still on YouTube, and do a mention your Pro Synth Network and your new time there.
Yeah, so I'm part of a group called ProSynth Network that is started as a group on Facebook, and we've slowly been kind of branching out. And it's myself and two other guys, Ben Simpson and Robbie Pericelli, and it's been a really fun adventure. We started what about 10 months ago or so, 9, 10 months ago, doing live streams. And now we've moved from Sundays to Friday nights, and that's I got to remember what the times are because everything's changed. So that's 7 p.m. London. It's going to be 11. It's 11 a.m. Fridays Los Angeles, and so whatever that works out between those two, if you can figure it out. But we talk about synthesizers and music production, hardware, software. We've had a lot of really cool guests, including Mr. Aaron Russell and Marshall Arnold, and all sorts of other cool people. And um, yeah, that's been a really fun and interesting journey with those guys, and we're having a blast. And I said we're just doing for the fun of it. So um, yeah, yeah, we So yeah, that's going on.
Yeah, and we have a lot of fun in the chat doing our best to screw you guys up and get you guys to say things that let us fill in slots on our bingo cards.
Yeah.
Okay, well,
Occasionally, one of the hosts helps you out a little bit.
yeah, throws us a bingo bone there. Well, thanks for having this chat with me and letting me share it with everybody, Cryss. It's always good talking to you. And
Thank you, Aaron.
we'll see the folks next time. Bye for now.